To get us started, I am super excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Denise Daniels from Wheaton College. She is going to be sharing all about exploring calling with students. Dr. Denise Daniels is the Hudson T. Harrison Professor of Entrepreneurship at Wheaton College. Her scholarly interests include meaningful work, Sabbath, leadership, gender, and motivation. She has written over 50 academic articles and book chapters and co authored several books, including Working in the Presence of God, Religion in a Changing Workplace, and one of my favorites, Working for Better, a new approach to faith at work. So, Dr. Denise Daniels, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and great to see people, although I can't see everybody on the screen at the same time, but nice to be here. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I talk with my students. I teach at Wheaton College in Illinois, which is a faith-based school. And so there's kind of an expectation that we are going to have conversations about faith topics in the classroom. And I talk with my students in entrepreneurship and management courses both about this idea of calling. Um, and I do it from a research-based perspective. So I know this is a teaching conference and not a research conference, but I want to just briefly share with you some information about how I frame calling and what it's based on. And so it's based on an empirical project an empirical study that I conducted with my friend Elaine Howard Eklund, who is at Rice University. And we did, over a 5-year period, we did nationally representative surveys of almost 16,000 people that we partnered with Gallup to do. We interviewed almost 300 people. Those people were folks who were either working or looking for work. It was a range of religious traditions and no religious tradition. We also talked to religious leaders, and then we surveyed and interviewed both in Spanish and in English. So it was a pretty broad survey, as you can imagine. And one of the things that we asked people had to do with their faith, and we also asked them questions about their experiences at work, and particularly for this purpose, their experiences of calling at work. What we found was that these folks really clearly identified their faith as linked to meaning and purpose at work. So and what I'm sharing here on the screen is the percentages of people who agreed with the statement that their faith helps them to experience meaning and purpose in their daily work tasks. And it's broken out by religious tradition. And you can see that those who are from religious traditions have higher scores here than those on the none side. So the no religion is obviously quite a bit lower. And that makes sense because you're asking about faith tradition, and folks who don't identify as having a faith tradition are not likely to say that their faith tradition matters to them in terms of experiences of meaning and purpose at work. But what you do see is that really more than half of our respondents said, yeah, my faith matters. It makes me experience my work in a more meaningful way. And so when I talk to my students about this, I explain to them that faith does matter. And then we start talking about what are the ways that faith might impact how you might conceive of a business, or how you might shape a business as an entrepreneur. What are some of the ways that you might think about that? And that gets us into the idea of calling. And a lot of our students talk about this idea of feeling called, but not all of them. And so I want to show you some other data that goes back to the survey that we conducted. And we asked folks about their experiences of calling. Do you experience your work, or do you see your work as a spiritual calling? And what you see here is that the response rates are quite a bit, not the response rates, but the positive responses are quite a bit lower. So we only have about 1 in 5 people on average say that they experience their work as a calling. Whereas when we were asking about, does your faith help you experience meaning at work, we saw more than half of our respondents said that it did. So here again, you can see it broken out by religious tradition. Our highest agreeers in this category were our evangelical Protestants, but even there, it was less than 2 in 5 folks were saying that their work was experienced as a calling. So then I talked to my students a little bit about some of the interviews that we did and that we conducted in the context of our research, and hopefully helping to help them frame a concept of calling. Before I get into that framing, let me just say a couple of other things about our data. I mentioned this previously, only 1 in 5 workers identify their work as a calling. We did see a gender difference, and so women were about twice as likely as men to experience a sense of calling or report a sense of calling. And another interesting finding that we talk about in class as well is the idea that a sense of calling starts to decline with increasing income. So the more money you make, the less likely you are to actually experience your work as a calling. And this is, I think, a little bit sobering to my students who like the idea of calling and also like the idea of making money. And so the juxtaposition here of these two things not necessarily being in alignment is something that's maybe puzzling, but also a little, makes them wonder. And so then we talk about this idea, well, how could we cultivate calling? Is that something that we can help people develop? And again, the research can help us here. In our interviews, as we were talking with people, we asked them about their experiences of calling and their experiences of meaning at work. And what we found was that for the few people who did say that their work was a calling, they started talking about it in a couple of different ways. And one of the ways they started talking about it was either as an intrinsic, their work was intrinsically experienced as a calling, or their work was extrinsically experienced as a calling. What does that mean? Intrinsically is the idea that the meaning or the sense of calling is bound up in what they are doing in the work itself, whereas extrinsically, it's the idea that their work is a means to another end, another important or meaningful end, but the work itself is not important. It's a means to some other important outcome. So we had people who were talking about calling in either of these two ways as we were conducting our interviews. We found a second dimension on which people also tended to talk about calling differently. And in this case, it was the extent to which or where they were experiencing this sense of calling. Either it was very close to them, very proximal to themselves and the workplace and where the work was being done, or it was more distal or farther away from them. So we call these, right, we termed this dimension the proximal distal dimension. I want to be clear here that no one in our interviews ever used the words proximal or distal. That's because we're academics. Um, and we've got a little bit of criticism here, like, what does that mean? But basically it's close and far. So you can get the idea that people are experiencing their calling either as something that's happening very close to them or farther away from them. Because these are two independent dimensions, we were able to map them onto each other. And so here on the screen, you'll see a framework that we came up with that captures this idea of calling along these two dimensions. And because it's two-dimensional, you end up with 4 quadrants. So let me talk just briefly about what calling means in each of these 4 quadrants, and then we'll have, I think, a few minutes for questions as well. So again, we have the 2 dimensions, intrinsic or extrinsic, and then proximal or distal. When you combine intrinsic and proximal, so on the lower left-hand side here, this is where people would talk about their calling as something that they experienced as a blessing from God. And we often heard very theological language when we were talking to people, even whether, almost regardless of whether or not they had a faith tradition. They would talk about God or higher power or something out in the universe in this way. But they had the sense that the work that they were doing was utilizing their own skills and talents in a way that felt very meaningful. And so that would be the lower left-hand quadrant. And then we had some people talking about their work as serving the common good. And so here we're moving up to the upper left-hand quadrant, the intrinsic and distal quadrant. And so they would say things like, well, what I'm doing, what I'm making, it helps the world in some positive way. They felt like the goods or services that they were providing were meaningful in some significant way because they impacted other people's lives positively. And then I'm going to move down to the lower right-hand quadrant. This is the idea of work as being both extrinsic and proximal. And so here we call this quadrant serving others at work. And the idea here is that the context of the work allows the worker to serve others. So it wasn't about the work itself, but it was about the location of the work, maybe the engagement with coworkers or the engagement with customers that somehow felt particularly meaningful, felt like a calling. And then the last quadrant is extrinsic and distal. This is the upper right-hand quadrant. And this is where people would say, oh yeah, I serve other people beyond my work. My work is a means to an end, and it doesn't even, the meaning isn't experienced at work. The meaning is experienced outside of work. And so we had, one woman that we talked with was a hotel housekeeper, and she didn't say anything about, cleaning rooms or making beds or being hospitable or creating a space for visitors to rest or anything like that. She said, yes, my work is a calling because it allows me to buy shoes for my children. And I have to say, I didn't actually do that interview. I read the transcript and I was kind of, my heart sank a little bit because I realized that I wasn't thinking about work in this way as a calling. And yet, of course, it is or can be a calling in this way. And so when I talk about this notion of calling with students and I have them kind of think through this 4 quadrant framework, I have them identify where they are most likely to find themselves. So where do they feel like they fit the best in this framework? And so students will frequently identify 1 or 2 of the quadrants where they feel like naturally that they fit. And then I ask them to think through, what would it mean to locate yourself in the quadrants where you don't naturally fit? So what would it look like to expand your notion of calling? And so we start talking about calling not as something that, some people have and some people don't, but as something that we can develop and that we can kind of expand our notions of. And then I have them think through, okay, now think about if you're going to be starting a business, because I'm teaching entrepreneurship students, how do you imagine feeling a calling in that context? And most of our entrepreneurial students find themselves in that lower left-hand quadrant. They talk about them, or sometimes the upper left-hand quadrant, but on the left side of this quadrant system, where they're thinking through the importance and value of what it is that they're going to provide, how it maps to their own skills and talents, but they're not really thinking about how their workplace might be experienced by employees or what people might do with the resources that they are able to provide them in the workplace. And so we start having them think through how could you have maybe a more fully orbed concept of calling. These 4 quadrants. I'm going to give you one quote from each one. So we'll start on that lower left, that notion of work as a blessing from God, or the intrinsic proximal quadrant. Here we talked to one woman who was a corporate trainer. She worked in a company in Georgia, and she said, for many decades, I have believed that one of my purposes on the earth is just to help people. God has given me a gift to teach and to train. And so obviously this is the job where in the job title, it's trainer. Being at this job, it allows me to do what I do well, which is train and educate. So this is a notion of intrinsic and proximal. Intrinsic and distal, this was a guy that worked at Subway. And he talked very poignantly almost about his Subway work. He said, the fact that it's Subway, it's vegetables and food and stuff that people can conceivably be nourished by, and located in some of the toughest regions in the world. And they feed a lot of people every day. I definitely did consider that and definitely considered, does that line up? Does that track with what I'm called upon to do by the Gospels? So very theologically thick thinking here in terms of how he's considering his work as a calling. That lower right-hand quadrant, extrinsic, proximal, this is the idea that people were saying, I help people that I interact with at work, or maybe I even share my faith at work. We had one guy who worked in a fruit packing plant. He didn't say anything about fruit packing in this notion of calling, but he says, look, people at the packing house, they have a nickname for me. They call me Yoda. And it's like they come to me if they have a problem. And even the people who don't believe in God do that. And so I've met with this one guy for, I don't know, it's been about 4 weeks trying to help him get reconciled with his wife. And so this employee was thinking really clearly about his work as a calling, not because of the tasks that he was doing, but because of the ways that his work allowed him to engage with other people at work. And then that last quadrant, and this particular quote is kind of funny to me because this guy initially told us that his work was not a calling. And in the course of the conversation with him, he changes his mind. And he says, my work it provides a means. We tithe. And so anything I do at work or in turn helps my church or any other organizations that we wish to give to. So I guess indirectly, that's somewhat of a calling. Man, I never thought of that before. And so he's starting to kind of convince himself that what he's doing in his work actually is meaningful in ways that are he can experience outside of work. I'm going to actually skip this next slide because we don't have time, but just very briefly, we do also talk about some downsides of calling in the classroom. But we kind of close with this notion that, there's a lot of ways to think about calling. And if we can expand our notions of calling, that could be healthy and good. Because we do have some data that suggests that work is people who experience their work as calling are more likely to experience meaning in their work. Faith broadly helps people to experience meaning in their work. People can experience that calling in very different ways, and we can help people expand those ideas of calling. If you're interested in these ideas in any more depth, both of them, we've got a couple of books that cover these. I know this is not a seminar on research, but there is data out there, so you're welcome to pursue either of these books. The one on the left, Religion in a Changing Workplace, is published by Oxford University Press, and it is really targeted to a very broad audience. The one on the right, Working for Better, is really targeted to a Christian audience. It's published by a Christian publisher. Both of these books have these ideas of calling embedded in them. So I think we have time for questions. Is that right, Jen?
Yes, that was
Okay.
wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. One questions that we do that was brought up was, do you have your students do a spiritual gifts assessment to consider how these may be integrated with calling and faith at work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I am aware of different spiritual gifts inventories out there. I have to tell you that I have not done the work to kind of look at the psychometric properties of those inventories. So I don't know how good some of them are. And if you've got recommendations, I would love to hear them. So feel free to email me, and my email's on the screen there. But you can certainly reach out to me either via email or LinkedIn. I'm also available there. So I don't do that, but it would be really interesting, I agree, to kind of see if there's an overlap between that experience of calling and this sense of giftings that people might also self-identify. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then the next question is, listening to both the distal quadrant approaches, I'm struggling to see these as representative of calling. They seem more like religious, spiritual justifications for the work. Any thoughts that might help clarify this?
Yeah, so I would suggest that if you were only in one of those right-handed quadrants, if you were only looking at your work as something that is a means to an end, then I would kind of agree with it. But what we are hoping that we can do, and what we found from the research that we did, is that it's helpful to have an entree point. So it's helpful if somebody is only experiencing their work as a calling because of the ways that they can engage with coworkers, for example. Start there and build. Start there and say, you know what, that's a good thing. That's good that you have this sense of experience of meaning in this particular domain in this way. Are there other ways that you could also experience your work as more intrinsically meaningful, for example? So it's not an either or. This is what I would consider a both and. And I think that for some people, the first purchase, the best purchase that they can get on this concept of calling is that distal idea. So that engineer who I quoted towards the end, who said, you know, maybe that is kind of a calling. I never thought of that before. That's an entree. That's a way of starting to think about calling, and then you can expand from there. So I would suggest that all four quadrants are actually useful and positive. And if we can think of our work as meaningful in each of those ways, that will be a thicker sense of calling than just having one or two approaches.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Denise,
Yeah.
for that session. That was truly great. I love the topic of calling because I think it's something that students are really trying to navigate as they go through their years at the university. So thank you so much for sharing that. Appreciate your time. I know you're in a super busy season with your new book launch and all of that. So thank you again for being
Yes.
with us today.
And 4 hours of teaching right as soon as I leave. So
Right, exactly. Thank you again.